Today, we're going to take a look at the new Silent Hill patch 1.04 on the AMD Radeon 7900 XTX. Now, we took a look at this yesterday on an RTX 4090, and we found out that, yes, there's been optimizations that improve stuttering. So today's test is going to be similar, but we're also going to take a look at the AMD FSR 3.1.1 implementation and see if the image quality is better than what it was. We'll look at FSR frame generation, and they've also added an option to enable disable HZB calling to fix stuttering on some AMD Intel GPUs. Now, I didn't notice any additional stuttering on AMD versus NVIDIA. They were very similar, but hey, we'll take a look at that as well. So let's dive in. We're going to start in the very beginning at 4K, ray tracing off, FSR quality, and the Epic graphical preset. On the left, we have the release version of the game, and on the right, the patched version of the game. And walking down these stairs, we always got a few stutters, which you can clearly see on the left side. On the right side, it's much smoother. We just got a tiny little hitch, but it's a pretty noticeable improvement. Now, I ended this run at the very first save point down the hill at the gazebo, and the 1% lows actually ended up being pretty much equal by then. It was 51 FPS for the release version and 53 FPS for the patch version. But clearly you can see that the new patch improves on some stuttering. But what about ray tracing? Let's take a look at ray tracing. Now, since we're checking out ray tracing, it can have a kind of a big impact to performance. So for this one, I've actually went from the Epic graphical preset to what I call the optimized. Shadow quality low and shader quality medium. It's not a big change to the image quality, actually. It's a good way to get some extra FPS. Now, turning ray tracing on doesn't make that big of a difference as far as what we got previously. We still get some hitches and stutters here going down the stairs on the release version, while on the patch version, it's way smoother. We just get a tiny little hitch. As far as 1% lows, though, by the time we got to the gazebo, on the release version, we had 47 FPS, and on the patch version, 51. So a bit of a bigger gap than what we previously had in the forest. But what about the town? So let's take a look at the town by Neely's bar, because that was kind of a problematic area that we also tested yesterday. Let's see if we can get similar results. All right, so we're going to skip ray tracing from now on. We're just going to focus on the Epic graphical preset, FSR quality, and let's go. If you watched my yesterday's video, we actually saw some pretty decent improvements here with the stuttering. But with the 7900 XTX making this same run, the stutters were actually similar, which was strange because the fixes that the developers made with the skybox theoretically should apply to all GPUs. But it was at this point that I remembered that they added a few calling options that should theoretically help AMD and Intel GPUs, so I figured that maybe that had something to do with it. So I decided to dig a little bit deeper and check it out, see if it makes a difference, because by the end of this run, which is the wall at the very end, the 1% lows were pretty much the same, and if you look at the frame time graph, the stutters are very similar, so that's kind of strange. Alright, so we were running the Epic graphical preset, and if we go to custom, the scene occlusion, it's set to occlusion queries. So that's what the Epic graphical preset is. We have an option to turn this off to disabled, or we can go with HZB. So let's test Epic graphical preset with HZB, then we'll test HZB with disabled, see if it makes a difference. On the left, we have HZB, and on the right, we have occlusion queries, which is the Epic graphical preset. And this didn't really make much of a difference for me. I still got very similar stuttering in the same exact places, and the 1% lows were also pretty much identical. Let's check out the Epic graphical preset and scene occlusion off, disabled. So I tested the same exact thing with scene occlusion off, disabled, guys, and it didn't really make much of a difference. As you can see, it still stutters the same way in the same area. So I'm not really sure if this setting is working at all, or if it's supposed to work in particular areas of the game. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. but just judging by what I can see here, I don't think we're going to bother with this setting moving forward. We'll just leave it on the Epic graphical preset. So let's take a look at the escape scene, because that's where we saw some really nice gains into fluidity on yesterday's video. Let's hope that's the same here. All right, so here we've gone back to 4K, FSR quality, ray tracing off, and the Epic graphical preset. Alright, so this sequence of the game is when you get the key to Woodside Apartments and you pretty much have to run. A storm picks up, and it was always quite sloppy, quite stuttery on the release version of the game. And with the patch version of the game, well, it seems to be fairly similar, although it is improved. The frame time is a bit better with the patch 1.04, but the 1% lows, it's about a 2 FPS difference between the two, so not as big a difference as we saw with NVIDIA. Maybe the game ran slightly less stuttery on AMD to begin with, and it didn't affect it as much in this patch. I don't know. But if we look at the scene where you first enter the Woodside Apartments, this lobby area was pretty choppy, pretty stuttery on the release version of the game, and with the patch 1.04, it's actually better if you look at the frame time. Now, if you compare 1% lows, it's still better with the patch 1.04. Not a massive difference, but it is an improvement for sure. Less stuttery. So overall, the patch 1.04 has helped, of course. It just seems that it was a bigger help for my NVIDIA GPU, apparently. Very interesting. But yeah, this is a pretty big difference on the 1% lows right now. 36 versus 43. That's pretty noticeable. Now, in yesterday's video, we didn't take a look at the indoor areas all that much. Let's take a look at them more here. So the settings are pretty much the same. 4K, hardware ray tracing off, FSR quality, Epic graphical preset. Now, for this one, what I did was I walked from this little backyard, or whatever you want to call it, up the stairs where it always used to stutter a little bit, and it actually is a bit better on patch 1.04. And then when you enter this room here and make your way out into the balcony, must have been a transition area because there was always a bit of stuttering there too. And it's still there on patch 1.04, but it's definitely better. And you can actually see that on the 1% lows, it is higher on the patch 1.04 side. So yeah, the apartments show actually sign of improvements. But what about FSR? Because they updated it from FSR 2 to 3.1.1. Well, let's take a look. Well, from what I can see, not much has changed in that regard. So this is the release version of the game with FSR quality. And if you move the camera back and forth, you can see there's quite a bit of flicker, especially with light reflection or light bleeding through the door. It was rather noticeable. Or looking at the frosted glass, you can see quite a bit of flicker. For example, if we swap over to XeSS quality, it actually does a bit of a better job. And if you looked at my 7900 XTX review of the game when it launched, I recommended using XeSS. But what about FSR 3.1.1? Does it change anything? Well, let's look at it. Here's the current version. As you can see, it says FSR 3.1 on FSR quality. And if you move the camera around, I pretty much see the same, very similar behavior. You still see that light bleeding through and a bit of flicker while moving the camera. And then if we zoom into the glass, it's more or less the same thing. You see that flicker with FSR. So it doesn't seem like the upscaling has really changed all that much. Now, this is the game at native 4K with ray tracing off and the Epic graphical preset. So as you can see, even at native, there can actually be a bit of ghosting with the leaves. So that can be quite noticeable. Now, let's go ahead and throw FSR. So it looks like FSR definitely adds a little bit more to the ghosting with the leaves. And I mean, this game has some ghosting issues even without using any form of upscaling. Even at native resolution, but I would say that FSR adds a little bit more to it for sure. Now, if we take a quick look at DLSS, it actually had some ghosting issues before the game got updated, as you can see with the leaves. Although you could have fixed it by updating manually to the latest DLSS and changing the preset with the DLSS tweaker. With the latest update, they actually fixed this issue. So if we compare FSR 3.1.1 on the left with DLSS quality as it is currently after the update, there's a pretty big noticeable difference as far as the ghosting goes with the leaves. So if maybe there can be a tweak. I don't know if you can mod FSR quality and tweak it, but that would be nice. But upscaling issues aside, what about FSR frame generation? Well, that's what I wanted to check out now. So we're running again at 4K with FSR quality, the Epic graphical preset. Now, the game is quite heavy at 4K, even with this. So we're not able to actually get a locked 60, but you can actually make a couple tweaks that'll guarantee us be above 60. So let's check that out first, and then we'll move on to frame generation. So if we go into custom advanced settings, set shadow quality to low and shader quality to medium, you'll get a pretty nice bump to your frame rate on AMD especially, but even NVIDIA, you will get a nice bump. So we went from 55 to 76 with FSR quality. Hardware ray tracing off, although you could enable hardware ray tracing on as well, but the game's going to be a bit more demanding. But we're not taking a look at that right now. Now, my only issue with the implementation of FSR frame generation in this game is that it's not decoupled from FSR upscaling. And the reason why that matters is because, as you saw, FSR upscaling is not particularly great in this game, and XeSS does a better job. And you should be able to use FSR frame generation with XeSS or DLSS if you wanted to. So it kind of sucks that developers don't seem to put a ton of thought into this, but it is what it is. We averaged 80 FPS without frame generation. So let's throw FSR frame generation on and see what happens. All right, so we're back where we started. We averaged 80 FPS, and now we're going to throw FSR frame generation on. Here we were getting around 75 FPS, and it's gone all the way up to 134, guys. That is a nice jump to our visual fluidity for sure. And it actually doesn't look too bad, if I'm being honest. As a matter of fact, we're actually generating more frames than I was getting with DLSS frame generation on the 4090. And this is actually somewhat of a common thing, that FSR frame generation will actually generate more frames than DLSS frame generation. I think AMD have actually done a really good job with FSR frame generation. As a matter of fact, it'll generate even more frames if you have an AMD GPU. So for example, my 7900 XTX, if you were to compare percentages, it'll actually generate more frames with FSR frame generation than my 4090 would with FSR frame generation, if that makes sense. So to me, it's kind of mind-blowing why AMD doesn't like advertise this. They kind of have an edge with this, but they don't, because Radeon marketing is terrible, in my opinion. It's kind of frustrating. See them fumble the ball when they have something as good as FSR frame generation. But as you can clearly see, we got a pretty big stutter there. Obviously, FSR frame generation is not going to save you from the stutters, but overall, we're actually getting a lot more frames, right? Remember, we averaged 80 FPS, and right now we're averaging 130 FPS. So it's not necessarily double the FPS, but kind of close to double, right? Double, it would have been 160 average with 130. But yeah, guys, a bit extensive of a look. I don't know if you like these longer videos or if you want rather have less information and shorter, but I have one more thing to show you and I'll share my closing thoughts, I guess. Alright, so while I share my thoughts, I wanted to show you guys this footage is at 4K hardware ray tracing off, FSR quality and frame generation with 120 FPS cap on the other side apartments. And I'm running around everywhere to show you, and it was actually pretty smooth. Kind of surprised actually how fluid it was. But I guess to address this update and how it impacts AMD, well, the occlusion options that they added to help with stuttering, as you saw, didn't really do anything. So I don't know, maybe that setting's not working or it applies to certain areas of the game. I don't know. But the FSR upscaling quality, they went from FSR 2 to 3.1.1. Image quality to me looks the same as it did before. There's some flickering issues and some ghosting issues, which is kind of unfortunate. But the FSR frame generation implementation, on the other hand, is actually pretty good. It generates a ton of frames, and I think it works pretty well. Now, on YouTube, the footage might have some ghosting trails, as it did for me with my DLSS frame generation footage. That's because the footage is being captured at 60 FPS, right? 30 of those frames are real, 30 of those are technically fake, but you have more frame rates while you're playing the game. So obviously to me, it doesn't look like that. It actually looks pretty good. So this was surprising, but that's not the whole story though. This game does have some areas that are extremely problematic and heavy. I don't know why. For example, check this out. This is a room on the other side apartments. It's where I'm at the moment as far as progress. And look at the frame rate, guys. This is at 4K with ray tracing off and FSR quality and the epic graphical preset. Look at that frame time graph. It shouldn't be this heavy. And it's not any better on NVIDIA, by the way. Check this out. This is at 3440 by 1440, so 1440 ultra-wide on an RTX 4090 with ray tracing, hardware ray tracing on, epic graphical preset, native, no DLSS. And look at this frame rate in this same exact area, 48 FPS. So there is some areas that are unusually heavy. Like this is just a bathroom. If you turn around, you're inside a bathroom. So, but yeah, other than that, I mean, the patch does improve stuttering. I saw bigger gains on the NVIDIA video I did yesterday, but the AMD GPU is doing really good as well. There are improvements, but the game is far from being perfect. There's still some stuttering issues, and I hope with a patch or two they can get it up to where it should be, because the remake itself is really good. It deserves better. It deserves to run flawlessly. So let's hope that happens, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Give the video a like if you liked it. Consider subscribing, and yeah, share your thoughts. I'd like to hear it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.